Module 2, Configure Web App Settings. In this module, you will be learning about the settings that are related to the deployment slots, the options on configuring the transport layer certificate for your app, how do you deal with diagnostic logins for monitoring and debugging, and what is a virtual app to the directory mapping. Let us see that. Now in the app service, there is something called app settings. To make it more easy, when you create an application, say for example, a Java or a Python or a PHP or a .NET application you build, the environmental variables, so-called app configurations, would be kept by you in the code. For example, in a .NET, app settings.json or webapp.config files, you stored your variables of environment in it. And why do we do that? This is something we can leverage as a benefit so that tomorrow you deploy your application to dev environment, you can just change the configurations in that app.config file to connect to the dev database. You can do the same for testing or staging or production. And same goes in here. A developer doesn't have to each time go and modify the code. Rather, in the environmental variables, he will provide the configurations. Now, tomorrow, whenever you come across the situation where you want to replace the code with the connection string of a dev database or a testing or QA stage of base, you can pass those app configuration names with the same names in the app settings, but with the respective values pointing to dev or testing or QA environment. On doing so, you now ensure that without modifying your code each time when the app is deployed to each stage, it will connect to the right area of connection it has. That could be APIs or databases or services it talk to using the connection strings. So in Windows, if you talk about, it's a very easy thing. You have app.config, even for Linux as well. But the thing is, in a Linux platform-based app environment, you also pass on these facility, which is an advantage. Similarly, in containerized platform of the Linux, you have environment flag that can be used, which is called container variables. How do I do this? In your Azure App Service, when they go to the app service, in the left side, you have configuration. In the configuration is where you can find out your facility, and that's going to be your app settings. So in the app settings, you can click on new app settings and you can start adding a key and a value, where the value is going to be the connection string of the database or API or whatever you want to connect to a dev or testing or staging. So for example, there is a dev server, then in your dev server, you are going to add these respective value. If it is a testing server, then in the testing app service, you go and you do the same. If it is a staging or production, you repeat that, which means in each environment, you do the same. The thing is, the key name was going to be common, which is in the code, but the value will change based on each environment. Sometimes it's not like you can add every environmental variable by clicking on new. So in such cases, you can pass on a JavaScript object notation. You can copy paste a lengthy content at once in an easier way. So this is the best strategy that we will use. In the upcoming demo, we will be leveraging this as a benefit. So this is an example of the bulk edit, where you can give the name of your configuration, a value, which is basically the value of it. So in case it's a connection string, then you say the type as SQL Server, and if it is a Microsoft SQL or PostgreSQL, the respective options you define. In the slot settings, as true or false, if you say false, it's like it's going to be a setting only for that particular app server. But if you say it's true, when you do swapping, a concept where you move your code from one slot to other, you swap the configuration as well. Now, some of the settings come into the picture, that is the general settings. You have a technical stack setting that is in your app service. In the same menu which I showed you earlier, there is a general setting menu in which you can specify the technical stack. That is like whether it's a .NET or specific .NET version or Python or a specific Python version. Platform settings you have, in that you can choose bit versions between 32 to 64 bit for your OS. WebSocket protocol can be enabled and disabled. Always on availability. And that's a concept where usually if your app service is not receiving any request for a time period, like let's say 30 minutes, it is idle. It will just bring your website down. In other words, it will make it inactive. So when a first request comes, it will take some time to respond for the request. So if you turn always on as on, there will be no idle time. That means your app is always in a hot tier, in a hot mode. So every time when a request comes, it will respond. Similarly, you can set the pipeline version for DevOps. You can choose HTTP protocols. You can also specify the ARR affinity. And that's a concept where when you scale for multiple instances, Azure is going to just create one more virtual machine for you in the data center. So in this ARR affinity, if it is turned on, Azure knows that, okay, this is something that is created for a very high availability. So let's say when we are creating more servers, we will ensure to place those more servers as physically closer as it is possible in the data center. So that's kind of algorithm that Azure will choose. So we can configure these. In terms of debugging, an ASP.NET based application or ASP.NET Core or Node.js application debugging can be done. An incoming client certificate part, you can configure client certificate. That's a transport layer authentication certificate can be specified by you. You can also say that only authorized connection should be allowed to log in into your application. You can even set firewall configurations if necessary. Now, configuration of path mapping. So in the Linux and containerized environment, you can connect an external storage to your containerized app that is hosted. So apps of Windows or Linux you go for, you can host both of them in the Azure App Services, and you can do this. When it comes to Windows app, which is non-containerized app, so in a Windows environment, what happens is that since the underlying storage is used as my data space, including the app service, application code and everything, you can create something called virtual directories in it. For example, abc.com/blog. So the blog will be a virtual directory in which I can host blogs separately. abc.com/API, I can host APIs in it. So this way you can add virtual directories. You can you can even have some custom scripts that can process certain extensions that you specifically require. So that means virtual directories and pointing of those virtual directories is possible here. Now, how about diagnostics and logging? So if you want to do application logging for the Windows or Linux platform, you can easily do that. You have plenty of code libraries available, and that can be used, and those will be logs that are generated, which can be used for analysis of your application performance. Web server logging you want to do for Windows, you can track the HTTP request data that's based on this log file format of W3C, and that's something you can enable. You want to get a detailed error log for Windows. In the HTML error pages, you can also find that from the client-based exception, and that's something you can find out in the log folders of your root. You want to track failed request in the Windows, you can do a tracing of the failed request, and this can be done using your logs. Deployment logging, when a deployment happens and fails for Windows or Linux, you can track these logs by checking out the deployment log files that are available, and these settings can also be configured in the platform. Going further, can I configure security certificate? Yes, it's mandatory thing in a business scenario, that is like transport layer security I'm speaking about. But yes, and an optional perspective of it, in a free app service managed certificate you will get, depending on you configure a CDN or you configure a service called Azure Application Gateway, you will get different choices. So you can even purchase an app service certificate. The first thing, if you go with the default domain of Microsoft, you get a free transport layer security certificate, and SSL is given for free, which is auto binded. You go for a custom domain, then you may have to buy a certificate. You can import that certificate into Azure Key Vault, and then you can upload your private or public certificates accordingly, and you can map it. So if you have a custom domain of your own and you want to bind that with an SSL, it is perfectly possible. You can easily do that. As a summary, in this module, we learned about the application settings like deployment slots, installation or configuration of those certificates in a theoretical discussion, diagnostics logging, and virtual app directories we explored in this discussion. You can also do a knowledge check with the questions in the right side to do a self-assessment for you.